something most people swallow every morning in a white capsule. The ancient world ground into a loaf and broke at the table without a second thought. Ezekiel's bread was not a single grain, but a dense mixture of wheat, barley, lentils, millet, and spelt stone ground together into something closer to a complete meal than what most people today would recognize as bread. And the magnesium alone in a single daily portion of that loaf would have exceeded what modern adults now chase through supplements, fortified cereals, and corrective diets. That one ingredient, magnesium, now missing from most refined flour because the milling process strips the bran and germ where it actually lives, once moved quietly through an ordinary household loaf, with enough density to do what the body needed before anyone had a word for deficiency. And the quiet violence of that removal is that no one announced it, no one replaced it with something equal, and the gap between what that bread gave and what modern bread withholds is now filled with capsules that cost money and carry instructions on a bottle. Jesus broke bread in a world where bread still meant something whole. But somewhere between that world and this one, the loaf lost most of what it was carrying. What makes that loss worth sitting with is not that it happened, but that it happened so quietly, no one in any single generation could feel the full weight of it. Refinement did not arrive as a declaration. There was no moment when the world was told, "We are removing what the grain carries. We are keeping the part that tastes lighter and stores longer, and we are not replacing what we took." It arrived as convenience, or as progress, as the whitening of flour that made bread softer and more shelf-stable and more uniform, and the minerals that lived in the bran and germ simply went with the part that was discarded. What remained was a loaf that looked like bread, tasted like bread, and filled the stomach like bread, but was no longer doing the deeper work that bread had always done without anyone asking it to. The thesis here is uncomfortable, because it is not about dramatic poison or deliberate harm. It is about a slow, structural subtraction that left the form of a thing intact while removing its content. And then, in a turn that would be almost elegant if it were not so telling, the missing content was isolated, packaged, and sold back to the same bodies that had been eating the incomplete loaf. Magnesium supplements, iron-fortified flour, B vitamin enrichment. The word enriched on a bread label means that some fraction of what was taken out has been added back in synthetic form, and the word itself carries the trace of the admission that something was impoverished first. But the admission was never made plainly. The label does not say we removed the germ and bran and replaced a portion of the nutrients with synthetic versions. It says enriched, as if the loaf received a gift rather than a partial correction. Magnesium sits at the center of this because its absence is now measurable in populations, not just individuals. The gap between what a person eating refined grain daily receives and what the body actually requires for muscle regulation, nerve function, and rest is not trivial, and it is not easily closed by a single supplement taken in isolation. But what matters here is not the physiology. That comes later. What matters now is the rupture itself. The recognition that the bread most people grew up eating, the bread that lined the shelves and filled the lunch boxes and appeared at every table as something ordinary and unremarkable, was not the same object that appears in the text of Ezekiel or at the table where Jesus sat. The distance between those two loaves is not nostalgic or aesthetic. It is measurable, and it began before any of us were born to notice it. There is a world behind this bread, and to understand what was removed, you have to feel where it came from. Not from a bakery, not from a factory, from a household, from a floor where a grinding stone sat heavy and low, worn smooth in the center from years of use, and from a woman's hands moving in the early morning, See, pushing grain across stone in the slow, circular rhythm that every household knew the way we now know the sound of a kettle or a coffee machine. The grain was kept in clay jars or woven baskets, multiple grains, often mixed, not because the household was experimenting, but because that was what the season and the storehouse had provided, and you used what you had in the proportions that stretched it furthest. The sound of grinding was a morning sound. In the ancient Near East, across the households of Israel and the surrounding regions, the day began with that low, gritty rhythm. Grain against stone, bran and germ still intact, the flour falling dark and coarse into whatever vessel caught it below. The smell was earthy and faintly sweet, the raw smell of cracked grain that is not yet bread, but is already something nourishing. By the time the fire was built and the flat stone or clay vessel was ready, the flour had already been mixed, often with water that had been sitting, sometimes with a piece of yesterday's fermented dough folded in, not for flavor, but because that was how the bread rose, slowly, the way things rose before there was a packet of dried yeast on a shelf. The loaf that emerged from that process was not beautiful in any way that a modern kitchen would celebrate. It was dark, it was dense, it was irregular in shape and rough at the edges, and it smelled of earth and fire and something faintly sour from the fermentation. It was heavy enough that you felt it in your hand when you picked it up, not the airy, yielding weight of a commercial loaf, but the compact solidity of something that had been compressed by its own content. Breaking it required 2 hands and some effort. The crust did not slice cleanly. The crumb was tight and moist, and you could see the pieces of grain embedded in it. And when you chewed it, you were chewing something that gave back, that had substance, resistance, presence. This was not a vehicle for something else. This was the meal. And to understand what it was made of, to really understand what the body was receiving when it ate this every day, you have to move into the grain itself. Wheat was the foundation, but not the soft, high-yield wheat that fills modern flour sacks. The wheat of the ancient Near East was harder, lower in gluten, closer to what it had always been before centuries of selective breeding pushed it toward volume and softness. It gave the loaf its body, its structure, and the thing that held everything else together when the dough was formed and set to bake. But wheat alone would not have been enough, which is why the recipe described in Ezekiel's text reaches beyond it. Barley came next, and barley in that world was the grain of endurance. It was cheaper than wheat, more drought-resistant, more accessible to households that could not always afford the finer grain, and it was slower to yield its energy. Barley ground into a loaf does not dissolve quickly. It sits in the digestion with weight and patience, releasing what it carries over hours rather than minutes, and it brought with it a fiber density that the wheat alone could not provide. You could feel the difference in a loaf that had barley in it. It was heavier, slightly bitter at the edge, and it stayed with you. Lentils were the unexpected ingredient, the one that crosses the boundary between grain and legume, and their presence in the mixture was not incidental. Lentils brought protein that grain alone could not supply. And more than that, they brought a kind of protein completeness that the combination of legume and grain achieves together in a way that neither achieves separately. Ground lentils in the flour gave the loaf a density and a slight earthiness that modern bread would not recognize, but what they gave the body was something that grain-only bread could not. They also carried iron and folate, and the mineral richness that legumes hold in their small, hard skins. Spelt was the ancient cousin of wheat, older, lower yielding, slower to grow, but carrying something that modern wheat lost when agriculture replaced it with higher volume varieties. Spelt's mineral content sits higher than modern soft wheat, Its gluten structure is different and more water-soluble, and its flavor has a faint nuttiness that ground fine smells almost warm. When you hold spelt flour in your hand, it is slightly coarser than modern all-purpose, and the grain itself is enclosed in a hull that requires more processing to remove, which meant that the germ and bran stayed closer to the final flour, and everything they carried stayed in the loaf. Millet was small and round and golden, and in a world where nothing edible went to waste, it rounded out the mixture with its own mineral load, including magnesium, sitting in the hull the way magnesium always sits, in the part that modern milling removes. So together, these 5 ingredients ground on stone produced a flour that was dark, fragrant, and structurally complex. And the loaf it became was not a primitive version of something that would later be improved. It was a more complete object than what replaced it. And what it did inside a living body was something that took the modern world centuries of absence to begin to understand. When a person ate this bread every day, nothing dramatic happened. There was no surge of energy, no noticeable effect, no moment of clarity or strength that arrived with the first bite. The body simply held together. That is the honest way to say it. The body held together in the way that a body holds together when it is consistently, quietly supplied with what it actually needs. The labor was hard. The day was long. The sleep was on the ground or on a thin mat. And there were no recovery supplements, no protein shakes, no targeted nutritional corrections. There was the bread, eaten in the morning and the evening. And the bread was doing the work that bread was designed to do before the word designed had any meaning in that context. The magnesium from the barley and millet and spelt moved into the body and did what magnesium does when it arrives from food rather than from a capsule. It participated in hundreds of small processes without announcing itself. Muscles contracted and released without cramping. Nerves carried their signals without the interference that low magnesium introduces. And blood sugar moved with more evenness through the day because the slow digestion of the grain and legume combination meant the body was not responding to sudden surges and drops. And at night, the body could descend into the kind of sleep that a magnesium-supplied nervous system can reach. Deep, restorative, not merely unconscious. This was not the experience of luxury. It was the experience of sufficiency. The laborer who ate this bread daily was not thriving because their diet was sophisticated. They were simply not being subtracted from. The body was receiving the raw materials it needed and using them without friction, and the absence of deficiency is so unremarkable that it leaves no record. You do not notice a body that is quietly complete. You only notice the body when something is missing. And by then, the missing thing has often been absent long enough that you have stopped looking for its source. That is what makes the modern comparison so quietly devastating. The person who reaches for a magnesium supplement in the morning is not doing something wrong. The supplement is real, and the body will use what it can from it. But the supplement exists because a removal happened first. Because the grain was stripped of the part where the magnesium lived, and the loaf was made lighter and whiter and longer lasting, and the body was left to manage on what remained, which was not enough. The capsule is not a discovery. It is a correction. And the difference between receiving a mineral from a whole grain you ground yourself and swallowing it from a bottle before your coffee is not merely symbolic. It is the distance between a body being fed and a body being patched. Now that you feel what the bread did, it matters to ask where it appeared when the world was paying the closest attention. Because the bread of the ancient world was not just daily food. It was the object chosen, again and again, for the moments that carried the most weight. In the account of Ezekiel, the bread appears not as a celebration, but as a command given inside a siege. God directs the prophet to take wheat and barley and lentils and millet and spelt to grind them together and bake the loaves over fire, and to eat this bread as his daily sustenance during a prolonged period of lying on his side as a sign for the people. The setting is deprivation and prophetic suffering, and the bread is not a comfort or a feast. It is the minimum necessary for a body to survive what it is being asked to endure. The fact that the minimum was that particular combination of grains, dense, mineral-rich, complete, was not incidental. It was what the body needed to hold together through extended physical and spiritual strain. The bread was not symbolic first. It was food first, and it was chosen as the food that could actually sustain life under pressure. In the Passover tradition, bread appears again at a table, and this time it carries memory. The unleavened bread of Pesach was made in haste, without time to let the dough ferment, and it was made from the same grain that the household had. Whole, stone ground, the same dark flour that daily life produced. It was not a ritual object disconnected from the kitchen. It was made in the kitchen, by the same hands that made the ordinary loaf, only quickly and without leavening, and it was broken and eaten with bitter herbs and with the awareness that this meal marked the edge between one life and another. The bread on that table was real grain, real flour, real weight in the hand. And then there is the upper room. Jesus sat at a table with bread in front of him, the same bread that the Passover table had always held, the same whole grain loaf that his hands had held since childhood, in a Galilean household where bread was made from what the land and the granary provided. When he broke it, he broke something physical, something dense and dark with visible grain in the crumb, something that had weight and resistance and required effort to tear. The act of breaking was not gentle. The bread that the New Testament records being broken was not thin or soft or symbolic in its texture. It was the bread of a working world, and the hands that broke it were familiar with that world. Whatever meaning rested on that moment, and the weight of it has moved through 2,000 years of remembrance. It rested on a real loaf, and that loaf was closer to what Ezekiel ground on stone than to anything that has appeared in a breadbasket in the last 100 years. Understanding that is not nostalgia. It is not a call to retreat from the present or to treat modern life as a failure. It is simply an opening, a door that the history of this bread invites you to walk through towards something practical and recoverable. Because if the loaf that held this much, nutritionally, historically, sacredly, has been displaced by something that holds far less, then the question the script has been building toward is not philosophical. It is immediate. What do you do tomorrow morning? The first thing is to learn to read what you are holding. Most bread sold today that calls itself whole grain is not doing the same work as a loaf ground from intact grain. The label is not always the loaf. What you are looking for is bread, where the first ingredient is a whole grain flour, where whole is not a marketing word, but a literal description of flour that still contains the bran and the germ. On the outer and inner portions of the grain, where the fiber, the minerals, and the slow-digesting compounds actually live. If the flour has been stripped of those layers first, and then had some bran added back, the structure of the grain has already been broken, and what you are eating is a partial reconstruction, not the original object. The weight of the bread in your hand is an honest signal. A loaf made from genuinely whole grain flour is heavier than you expect. It does not compress easily. Its crumb is tighter and denser, and the slice does not tear the way commercial bread tears. That weight is not a flaw. It is the mineral and fiber content you are feeling. The second thing is to move toward the grain combination. what Ezekiel's text describes: wheat or spelt alongside barley, and with lentils or another legume in the mixture, is not an archaeological curiosity. It is a practical nutritional logic that remains available to anyone with access to a grocery store or a bulk grain supplier. Spelt flour is increasingly findable, and it can replace or partly replace standard whole wheat flour in any bread you make at home or any flour blend you look for on a shelf. Barley flour, often overlooked, adds the fiber density and slower digestion that wheat flour alone does not provide. And the legume component, whether lentil flour folded into the dough or cooked lentils pressed into a flatbread, closes the protein gap that grain-only bread leaves open. You do not need a stone quern to close the distance. You need to move toward variety and wholeness in the grain itself, and away from the single refined source that modern bread defaults to. Even soaking and sprouting whole grains before using them, a practice that ancient fermentation partially replicated, reduces the compounds that block mineral absorption and allows the magnesium and iron and zinc already present in the grain to be received more fully by the body that eats it. The third thing is to understand the magnesium thread for what it is. If you are currently supplementing magnesium, that supplement is not wrong, but it is worth knowing that it exists because something was taken from the grain before it reached you, and the supplement is attempting to replace what the grain once carried on its own. Moving toward whole, multigrain, legume-inclusive bread does not make the supplement irrelevant for everyone. Bodies vary, and some people need more than food alone provides. But for most people eating refined grain as a daily staple, the supplement is correcting a removal rather than filling a gap that always existed. The goal is not to stop correcting. The goal is to understand the correction well enough to begin moving, gradually, toward a daily loaf that does more of the work by itself, so that the capsule on the bathroom shelf becomes less necessary, not because someone told you to stop taking it, but because the morning bread has begun to carry more of what it was always supposed to carry. There is something in the act of breaking bread that has never fully lost its meaning. Even now, even in a world where bread has lost most of its content, the hand that breaks it still carries the echo of every hand that broke bread before it. Over stone ovens, over Passover tables, in upper rooms, in the long ordinary mornings of working households where the grinding stone had already been turning since before the light was fully up. What those hands were breaking was a loaf that knew something its makers did not have language for. It carried magnesium and fiber and slow protein and the mineral logic of mixed grains without anyone naming those things, because they did not need to be named. They were simply present, in the flour, in the bran and germ that the stone kept intact, in the legumes ground alongside the grain. The body received them and continued. The labor was sustained. The sleep was deep. The day was long, and the loaf was enough. We have spent the better part of a century chasing in bottles what that loaf provided in a morning meal. And the chase is real and sometimes necessary and not without value. But it began with a removal, and the removal was never fully announced. And the distance between the bread that Ezekiel was commanded to eat and the bread that most people slice at their kitchen counter today is not a matter of taste or preference. It is a matter of content, and the content can be recovered, not completely, not all at once, but genuinely, one loaf at a time, one grain choice at a time, one morning at a time. If what this channel uncovers feels like something worth returning to, the food, the labor, the table, the ordinary sacred weight of daily things, then stay close. There is more to recover. And the best place to begin is the same place it always was, at the table, with a loaf that is heavier than you expected, breaking it with both hands.